Hello, it is March 29th, 2020. We are at the end of our second week of social distancing from the COVID-2019 pandemic, and we're using this opportunity to continue our series of interviews with my father, John Fawcett. Our first interview, we covered a lot of ground with presidential visits to the Hoover Library and Dad's early career as an archivist. And I believe we left off after you were discharged from the Army, but we'll kind of pick up here starting with your time in Austin. And
this will overlap a bit from the previous one. Essentially, my assignments in the Army while I was at the LBJ, working for LBJ. The number one thing LBJ was working on after he left the White House was writing his memoirs. But by writing his memoirs, he had Harry Middleton, Bob Hardesty, a whole series of people who were drafting chapters. He would comment on them and they'd go back. And I was one of the people that did the background research for the book. And that's where Sharon was very much involved in that as well. So we should do a joint recording on going through all of that.
good idea for a future interview.
Exactly. And you may never finish this project, Alan. In addition to Bob Hardesty and Harry Middleton, who worked on the memoirs full-time, he had Walt Rostow was actually teaching at the University of Texas and working on the foreign policy aspects of the memoirs. And Doris Kearns Goodwin was also one of the authors. Sharon worked primarily with Doris. And so very interesting. I was surprised at actually how little the LBJ spent working on writing his memoirs, but he took great delight, I remember, in catching the various authors' mistakes they would make, particularly dramatic mistakes. And I remember Doris telling me about, yes, it was some grammatical error. And he just delighted in saying, you're a Harvard graduate and you have to depend on me to catch your grammatical errors. But at any rate, that we ought to do one together since we were both very much involved in that. I remember, though, the request we hated the worst, which was when LBJ would say, "Prove I never said that." And having to disprove the negative was what we disliked the most. At any rate, that can be put together and might be interesting to some people. One of my most vivid memories of working for LBJ was his trip to the Hoover Library. It sort of was very much unplanned trip. After he'd left the White House, he always had some severe heart problems that he was dealing with, and his doctor, he used the doctors at the Mayo Clinic, and in addition to the doctor he had there in Austin. And I'm not sure how that this came about, but he was scheduled to go to the Mayo Clinic for a physical checkup and get the assessment of doctors up there. But for some reason, he decided to visit the Hoover Library on his way up to the Mayo Clinic. As it turns out, this is the only presidential library that he ever had visited. And I, of course, had a lot of interest in it because with respect to the planning, my father was involved in it from the Presidential Library Association. And in fact, Dad had a photograph taken of him talking to LBJ in which he was poking him in the chest, making a point, and
that's a great picture. I'll edit in a frame of that.
Could you do that?
It was Floyd giving LBJ the LBJ treatment. I love that.
It was. But at any rate, so I felt like I was involved in planning the trip because I was the expert on what was at the Hoover Library. At any rate, after I had talked to the director of the library and my dad, and the trip itself, I don't think they were at the library more than half an hour or 45 minutes. It may have been more than that, but not much more. And it was simply a tour through the library, looking at the exhibits, and I remember very vividly when LBJ came back from his trip to the Mayo Clinic. He called a staff meeting of all the library staff, and this, I'm pretty sure, I don't remember any other occasion. This was the only staff meeting he ever had with us. At any rate, I was just amazed that LBJ had, in talking to us, said, "Yeah, you may know I visited the Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa on my way." And he said, before I went through that library, all I knew about Herbert Hoover was that he caused the Depression. And he said, but I went through that library, and he told the whole story. About his mining career, Secretary of Commerce, and all of the things that went on there, and the presidency. He said he told us this whole story, and he said, all I knew before I went through that exhibit was that Herbert Hoover had caused the Depression. But after going through that, I learned what a great man he was. And he turned, and he sort of turned his head, and he said, and that's what I want y'all to do in my library. So that was quite a interesting thing on my part, having so closely connected with LBJ and with the Hoover Library. I've told that story many times, but I enjoyed telling it more than once.
I think there are more stories of Doris Kearns Goodwin and her time at the LBJ Library. That would be good to tell.
Right.
People always love to hear those.
This all took place in Harry Middleton's office. He had the largest office of any of the speechwriters or anything, and it was L-shaped and had bookcases, and I remember I had brought up a whole cartload of papers that Harry had wanted that related to something that he was writing. So I was up there doing the final arrangement for him on that, and Harry was a cut-up, always joking, and it was all sort of bedlam in his office. And that's the way it was. But if LBJ would call, it was, "Sit at attention." "Yes, sir." "Yes, Mr. President." But I looked around, and Doris was sitting on the floor and had talking. And Harry was carrying on, and I initially thought that Doris was just talking to a friend from back in Boston, and didn't think much about it. And it was noisy and all this commotion. And all of a sudden she said something that made me realize she was talking to LBJ. And it was so, the contrast between when Harry was talking to LBJ and when Doris was talking, it was quite a difference. So I remember I told her, I think, that, I didn't realize she was on the phone with LBJ. And she told me, she said, yeah, she felt that she did have a special relationship with LBJ because he, when she first met him, when he was president, and she was had been selected to work in the White House as a part of the program she was enrolled in. But he felt that she was his conduit to the protesters on Vietnam. And so she said he couldn't understand why all these students are opposed to the Vietnam policy, and he was sure he could figure out how to relate to them if he got to know Doris that well.
So, when we were talking last week about how the impression that was made on you about how few people actually had a relationship with LBJ, and people that you assumed would be talking to him regularly, like Harry Middleton would really be impressed when they did have those interactions. And clearly, in telling the story about Harry or Doris's relation and talking to LBJ even after the presidency, you could see that behavior still. I'm just curious, to what extent did you actually have a chance to interact with LBJ in Austin?
Very little. He obviously knew. He knew that I worked there and this sort of thing, but and I was, for instance, driving Harry out to have meetings with LBJ. He would know me well enough to say hello, and that was probably about it. He did, I remember he had called both Sharon and I up to thank us after the Vantage Point was done, and gave us both a check for $1,000, which I remember. I'm trying to remember whether it was who it was. He was the supervisory archivist, later the assistant director. Why can't I say his name? Another name to add to my list of trying to remember. But he said, you shouldn't be accepting those checks, because that's he's reimbursing you for things that you were paid as a government employee. I think Sharon and I both thought about that for maybe a second or two, but then decided we'd accept the check.
And that was all for your help on the memoirs?
Right.
So we wanted to also tell the story here about when you actually were discharged from the Army and your transition from working as a military personnel on detail in your civilian career as an archivist.
In some ways, it's hard to distinguish from one from the other because actually nothing changed other than I got a much larger paycheck. But I had all of a sudden realized I had to go down to Fort Sam Houston to get to be discharged, and I was supposed to wear a uniform, and I didn't have a uniform. I had all the bits and pieces, but I'd never worn it. And at any rate, I asked Sharon to help get all the patches on and everything because I figured her dad was in the Army. she would know how. So, and she did. And fortunately, she just pinned the insignias on, because as I got down to Fort Sam Houston and I was in the PX, and I noticed several people looking at me, and then I realized I had the patches reversed. So I went into the men's room, and fortunately they were pinned on so I could, and as I came out, there was a colonel, or he was a full colonel. He said, glad to see you got that right now. So that's
any more LBJ stories to share?
I can't think of many. There is one. I remember LBJ had I can't remember the occasion, but LBJ had started smoking, and he let his hair grow long, and he was smoking cigarettes, and someone asked him, why in the world did you just, after he had quit smoking in 1955 after his first heart attack, why did you start it? He said, the pressure of running this ranch got to me.
So LBJ started smoking again, but he didn't actually live that long after his presidency.
No.
So it might be good to tell, when did LBJ finally pass away, and what happened with the funeral for the president, and how did the presidential library change post having a living former president?
When LBJ had named Harry Middleton as director, the Archivist of the United States was Burt Rhodes, and there were a lot of things. There were 5 ladies who some referred to as the Vestal Virgins, that who were all on National Archives payroll. And I remember some occasion when Burt Rhodes was down there, and he described meeting with LBJ, and LBJ was sitting there with his legs crossed, and when it was bouncing his leg back and forth, and whenever he wanted to make a point, he'd kick Burt in the kneecap. And so, but part of, I remember Harry telling me that he told Burt Rhodes, he said, from now, as long as LBJ is living, I've got to, he is my boss. But after his death, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So there was a sort of a unwritten but a verbal commitment that things would change, and they did.
It was 74 when LBJ passed away?
January 74, I think. Yeah.
So when Hoover passed away, he was buried there near the birthplace at the library. What was LBJ's funeral like?
It was a much larger event. He was buried at the family cemetery out on the banks of the Pedernales River, but there were a huge number of people coming out. It was quite a commemoration, but in many respects, a lot of us were relieved. A lot of the pressure and potential pressure that came out of that were a part of our lives while he was alive were no longer. It was much easier to do your job. No, I don't want to.
All right, this story won't be told. Well, there are some stories that are best left unrecorded, but maybe I convinced you to tell some of them that
I'll do
are worth worth memorializing here.
Secret Service agents are a source of some great behind-the-scenes stories because, one, they don't tell many people, but they are with the various individuals on a very close basis. But this is an agent who accompanied LBJ and Lady Bird out to California. President Nixon had named the
Rebecca Baines Johnson.
Rebecca Baines Johnson Redwood Forest, and he said, this agent said, after the ceremony and they were going over to get on the helicopter and come back, and he said he'd noticed LBJ, really paying close attention to all of the improvements that Secret Service had paid for at San Clemente, and he said, as they were going to the helicopter, he took Lady Bird's arm and leaned over and he said, "That son of a bitch is a bigger crook than I am," referring to all of the improvements that he'd gotten Secret Service to invest in.
Well, in the post-LBJ years that you were at the LBJ Library, I know Lady Bird took on a much larger role there. Do you have any good stories you want to share with us in your time with Lady Bird?
She was very much involved in the wildflowers in Texas, and she was planning a trip to go through East Texas, which near her birthplace, and during the wildflower season, and she had wanted photographs to be taken. And at that time, I was in charge of the audiovisual section of the library in terms of the archival responsibilities. All of the still photographic work was done by Frank Wolf, who was the White House photographer, and Frank was sort of opinionated, and Lady Bird had asked him to if he would accompany her on a trip and take photographs, and Frank said no, he wouldn't. He took photographs for the president, and she wasn't president, which was sort of audacious. I think Harry Middleton was the one that was the go-between on this. Frank didn't tell Lady Bird that. He told Harry Middleton that. So Harry came to me and said, "Would you take the photo? Do this?" And I said, "Sure, we can." And I'll have James Watson, who worked for me, do motion picture. And I'm not a professional photographer, but I can. I have a camera, so I ended up taking still photos. James did the motion pictures, and we spent, I think, 4 or 5 days doing wildflowers. So that was very interesting and actually very enjoyable to spend that much time with Lady Bird.
Curious, I don't recall ever seeing those photos. Do you still have those? Or
no. They're I gave them to Lady Bird. I don't know where they would have ended up. They're probably in the library.
Well, that's
But they wouldn't be if Frank was there when they got sent down.
Be a project for a future trip to Austin, is to go to the library and do some research, see if we can find those.
Oh, that
photos.
might be. Yes.
Well, I know there are also lots of stories with LBJ and Lady Bird's daughters to relate from that time.
Lucy came in, and she was working for some charity. I don't even remember what it was, but she came down and wanted to know if we would record her giving an endorsement for this charity. And Lucy had a tendency to go on, and so I did this tape, and it was way too long, but I accidentally had erased a section of it, and so I went back and managed to edit together so that it didn't sound like there was a break in the tape. It was but it shortened it sufficiently, actually, so that it ended up being approved just as is, and it turned out to be exactly the right length. And I thought, how fortunate! My mess up, it wasn't even noticed, even by Lucy.
Well, speaking of tapes, a story you haven't told yet that I know we need to get to is the recording that is now being played at the LBJ Library of the animatronic LBJ telling jokes.
That, again, this is my, as head of the audiovisual department, I guess it hadn't even been a year after LBJ died, that James Watson and I'm missing, can't say a name.
we'll put it in the notes if we can remember the name later.
Okay. Well, James Watson and my employee, who I can't remember the name right now, it'll come to me. They had, I think it was James's idea. He said there are a whole bunch of very good jokes and humor that LBJ inserted in his informal remarks, and you don't get a sense of his sense of humor in his formal remarks, but you do out of these informal. So we went through and just found a whole bunch of these, and edited them all together. So we had it was really a very good example of LBJ's humor. At any rate, once the tape was done, I took it up to Harry and I said, do you think, is it too soon after LBJ's death to share this with Lady Bird? And it was Christmas time, and Harry was unsure of it, but he said, yeah, let's send it out. And so we sent it out. I think Harry put a cover on it to say, these are stories that LBJ often told, and here they are for your enjoyment. And at any rate, it went out at Christmas time, and there was great anticipation to see whether Lady Bird would react to him. There was no response, and because of the way that it went out, it was just something that Harry was letting her know. There was no need for a response, but we were hoping for one. At any rate, I think it went on, and then it was at least 2 months, maybe 3. A Secret Service agent came into my office and we'd send a tape recorder out for her to listen to him. He said, "Can you fix this tape recorder? It had that humor tape in it, and she played it so much it broke." So that was, and she did enjoy it, and then it became a part of the exhibit. I think it's still playing today. They've done it in many formats. The latest one was an animatronic LBJ that has gestures that are very appropriate for that tape.
So, I have fond memories of that animatronic LBJ and those tapes from, certainly from my grad school days there. But I'll tell one of my own stories. When I was in grad school at University of Texas in the econ department, and actually Elaine and I both took Walt Rostow's class, and we met there in the top of Walt's office at the top floor of the LBJ Library, and so
you and Elaine met.
Elaine, we both took Walt's class in separate semesters, and the semester I took his class, there were only 5 of us in the class, and he invited us out to his house for a dinner, and told us that he might invite some neighbors over to join us. And we got over there, and we're having our cheese and crackers to start out with small talk, and then his neighbor showed up to join the conversation, and it was Lady Bird. She came and joined us. So I actually I told her that story of the tape.
Oh, really?
And told her that who my parents were, and she was very thrilled to hear it, and mentioned Dad always told the story about the jokes, and she was fondly remembered.
And she did remember
Yes,
them. It shows I wasn't stretching the truth too much.
So I know in your time in Austin, you also started grad school at UT. How did that come about? What were you studying?
Well, I was in the political science. I was in the government department, and after LBJ's death, we've often, Sharon and I have often joked about how much comp time we accumulated. I applied mine to graduate school, and actually I completed all the coursework and the written comprehensives, and I had done everything except for the dissertation. So, but I'm stuck on a name again. The head of presidential libraries who hired me.
Dan Reid.
Yes, Dan Reid. I couldn't dredge his name up, but he came out, and I remember we had a sailboat out there then on Lake Travis, and he wanted to go sailing, so I took him sailing, and we talked, and I think he, even before he left, he said he wanted his deputy slot. His deputy was Dick Jacobs, and Dick Jacobs he was off on a detail, and he wanted somebody to just do that job at least until Dick Jacobs came back. So and I said I was probably within a year I could have my dissertation done. And he said, well, he needed somebody right away. And he said, I can't guarantee this job will come open again. And so there was considerable pressure there. At any rate, I ultimately decided to take the job and try to work in, and the dissertation, I already had the topic picked, and I had done a presentation to a class of my supervising professor, and asked me to do the presentation, and I did it, and then ultimately one of the students in that class took the topic, and my advisor was very upset, and I said, you can't really object, because in a sense, I mean, I was depending on papers that were available in the LBJ library. And I thought, well, it'll be easy to change topics. And this other student had a point. I mean, I could be accused of using my access to these papers so I thought it would be easy to change. As it turned out, I never could work. So that's the sort of the full story of why I never finished my doctorate.
So what year was it that you moved to Washington to take the deputy job?
1976. And I was there, I got there, Dan Reid retired. There was some political manipulations going on, and the new head of presidential libraries was very much on the outs with the new Archivist of the United States, and so it became apparent to me that I was lined up with the wrong factions within the archives, and so when the when the offer for becoming the executive director of the Hoover Library, that was very attractive. And that was, so I don't know that I've ever told you that.
Well, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but rewind a little bit. So 1975 is when I came along. Was it 76 that we all moved to DC, or was that did you take the job before the rest of us moved out there?
Maybe I have the years wrong.
I always thought it was
78.
78.
78. Yeah.
Yes. So 78 was when
Yeah.
that makes more sense.
Yeah. Except that doesn't because 83 is when we went to Iowa.
Well, but we were in DC in Annandale, 78 to 83. Isn't that right?
Oh yeah. So 78 to 83. Is that, how many years is that? I thought I was 5. Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we should pick up with the Iowa stories and the move out to Iowa to become the executive director of the Presidential Library Association in our next video.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. Well, again, this is our second week of self-isolation for the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're being quite productive in our interviews here. And I greatly enjoyed talking to you about all this, Dad. I'll edit together this one a little bit, and we'll pick up with the move to Iowa next week.
Sounds good.